Welcome back to Shadow Files, secrets they don't want revealed. Tonight, we travel to the Green Hills of Maryland, a place that looks ordinary from the outside, yet hides one of the darkest secrets in American history. Our story begins in the summer of 1968, when a modest family of four, the Wilsons, moved into a white two-story house at the edge of Frederick County. To the west, the land rolled into soft, tree-covered hills. To the east, cornfields stretched as far as the eye could see. The Wilsons were the definition of ordinary America. John Wilson worked for a local printing company. His wife, Elaine, taught piano lessons to neighborhood kids. Their children, 8-year-old Ben and 10-year-old Rachel, spent their afternoons exploring the woods behind their home, catching frogs and riding bicycles down the gravel road. It was supposed to be a new beginning, a slower life, a safer one. But less than a year later, the dream turned to something else. In March of 1969, John began suffering from unexplained fevers. His wife followed, then both children. Doctors initially suspected food poisoning, then influenza, then nothing at all. The symptoms didn't fit: high fevers, violent chills, muscle spasms, and a strange rash that came and went like bruises under the skin. Blood work revealed abnormalities no local doctor had seen before: irregular white cell counts, signs of infection but no identifiable bacteria. One physician at the Frederick Memorial Hospital sent a note to the county health office. Within days, two men in dark suits arrived at the Wilson home. They didn't introduce themselves. They wore no badges. They asked a series of precise questions. Where did the family get their water? What brand of groceries did they buy? And had they noticed any unusual odors coming from the woods nearby? When Elaine asked who they were, one of them smiled and said only, "We're from the Department of Agriculture." After they left, no one heard from them again. Over the following months, the Wilsons grew sicker. Their dog died. Birds stopped nesting in the trees around the house. And at night, John began to hear something, a low mechanical hum coming from the hill beyond their property. Locals told him it was probably the generators from the old army base. "That's Fort Detrick," they said. "Nothing to worry about." But John did worry. Because when he walked toward the sound one evening, following it past the tree line, he found a chain-link fence topped with razor wire and signs that read "Restricted Area, U.S. Biological Research Command." Fort Detrick. He had no idea what that meant at the time. But he would soon learn. Fort Detrick had been, for decades, the epicenter of America's secret biological warfare program, a place where scientists experimented with some of the most dangerous pathogens on Earth: anthrax, tularemia, Q fever, Venezuelan equine encephalitis, and worse. Officially, it was called defensive research. Unofficially, it was something else entirely. During the 1950s and 60s, while the Cold War gripped the world in silent terror, the U.S. military tested aerosolized pathogens, spraying them in controlled environments to study dispersion. Some of those tests, we now know, were not conducted entirely within laboratory walls. Declassified records later revealed that open-air experiments had taken place in San Francisco, New York, and even the Washington, D.C. metro area, using harmless simulants like Bacillus globigii to mimic biological agents. But harmless is a relative term. By the time the Wilsons moved into their home, Fort Detrick's boundaries had shifted, its classified zones expanding beyond what local maps showed. The hill behind their house wasn't just any hill, it was part of a containment buffer, a safety perimeter for a high-risk test facility known only by its internal code, Area 3B. No one told the Wilsons. No one told anyone. The hum John heard at night wasn't a generator. It was the low-frequency vibration of an underground air filtration system, one designed to vent controlled exhaust from the facility, air that, if the filters failed, could carry particles invisible to the eye, lighter than dust. By late summer, the Wilson children were bedridden. Rachel's hair began to fall out in patches. Ben complained of metallic taste and night terrors. The family's cat, which often slept near the vents, died suddenly one morning with no visible cause. Neighbors began to whisper. The local doctor filed another report, this time to the Maryland Department of Health. A week later, the report disappeared from his office records. That fall, strange things started happening in the surrounding area. Cattle on nearby farms were found dead, their carcasses swollen and discolored. 2 postal workers at the Frederick Mail Center fell ill with similar symptoms to the Wilsons. The connection was never made publicly, but internal memos from the U.S. Army's Biological Defense Command, later leaked in the 1980s, reference a potential cross-contamination incident linked to aerosol dispersal trials. In plain terms, something had leaked. And it had drifted, across the fences, through the trees, down the hill, and into the Wilsons' backyard. The illness wasn't contagious. It didn't spread to others. Whatever it was, it seemed tied to environmental exposure. John began keeping a diary. His handwriting grew erratic, feverish. One entry from November 1969 reads, "The air tastes wrong again. Elaine says I'm imagining it, but the smell is sharp tonight, like bleach and wet soil. Rachel's skin burns in the sunlight now. Something is eating us from the inside." By Christmas, Elaine could barely stand. The children's fevers spiked. And then suddenly, the symptoms eased. Not vanished, just faded, as if someone had turned down a switch. Within weeks, men in protective suits were seen working behind the Fort Detrick fence. Locals were told it was routine maintenance. Trucks came and went at night, carrying large metal canisters stamped with radiation symbols.
The Wilsons slowly recovered.
But their health never fully returned. Years later, John developed liver failure. Elaine died of a rare autoimmune condition. The children grew up, but both struggled with chronic respiratory problems. The house on the hill remained, silent, ordinary, its paint peeling under the Maryland rain. But the story didn't end there. In 1977, a Senate committee led by Senator Edward Kennedy opened hearings into government biological testing. Among the documents presented was a reference to an incident labeled MD-72 Alpha. It described possible civilian exposure within proximity of containment zone, Fort Detrick. The file was brief, heavily redacted, but one detail stood out: the location coordinates matched the Wilson property line. When journalists pressed the Pentagon for comment, a spokesperson dismissed it as an administrative mislabeling. Yet buried in a 1978 Washington Post article was a quote from a retired Fort Detrick engineer. "We used to say the wind decides what's classified." Think about that for a moment. The wind. The same invisible force that carried dandelion seeds across the Wilsons' yard, that rustled the trees above their roof, it carried something else that year. Something you couldn't see, couldn't smell, couldn't name. And the more you dig into the archives, the stranger it gets. By the mid-1960s, Fort Detrick had been conducting aerosol survivability trials, using pathogens suspended in microscopic droplets. Those tests studied how long bacteria could remain active when exposed to sunlight, moisture, and air. One report notes that during certain months, airborne drift extended several hundred meters beyond the controlled perimeter. 300 meters. The same distance between the Wilson home and the fence. Coincidence? Maybe. But coincidences lose meaning when they repeat too often. In 1970, just 1 year after the Wilsons' mysterious illness, President Nixon publicly announced the end of America's offensive biological weapons program. Fort Detrick was rebranded as a medical research facility. Its laboratories were renamed the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, USAMRIID. Officially, the purpose changed. Unofficially, the walls didn't. And as the years passed, residents near Frederick continued to report oddities: strange odors after rainfall, unexplained animal deaths, helicopter activity at night. Local newspapers occasionally mentioned rumors of contamination, but stories were quietly retracted days later. The Wilsons moved away in 1972. Their house was sold twice after that, each time to new tenants who stayed only a few years. One later told a reporter that sometimes, when the wind blew from the west, she could hear a low hum at night, like the ground itself was breathing. She said she'd wake up with nosebleeds, her pets restless. She moved out after her third dog died. The house still stands today. If you drive north from Frederick along Rosemont Avenue and turn toward the hills, you'll see it, a simple white home with green shutters, overlooking the valley. There are no warning signs, no fences, nothing to suggest that half a century ago, it may have been part of one of the strangest and most frightening chapters in Cold War America. But the land remembers. And sometimes, when the fog rolls down from the mountains, locals say the hum returns, faint, rhythmic, like breathing through metal lungs. The story of the Wilson family might have faded into local folklore, another ghost story whispered across the Maryland hills, if not for a journalist named Martha Keene. In 1981, Keene was working for a small paper in Hagerstown, covering agriculture and local business. But she had a background in investigative work and a sharp instinct for stories that didn't add up. One evening, while reviewing archival land records, she noticed something strange: a series of sealed property deeds surrounding Fort Detrick. Every one of them listed as environmental containment buffer zones. What caught her attention was that one of those plots overlapped with the old Wilson property. She dug deeper, requesting files from the Frederick County Health Department. The clerk hesitated before handing her a thin folder labeled Medical Incident, March 1969. Inside was a single-page report stamped Copy Only. Most of it was blacked out, but one line remained. Subject household exhibited multi-system infection consistent with environmental exposure. Adjacent facility, Bede RC, Fort Detrick. Keene's curiosity turned to obsession. She began interviewing former Detrick employees, janitors, technicians, lab assistants. Most refused to speak. But one, an elderly man named Harold Lytle, agreed to meet her in a diner off Route 40. He wore thick glasses and chain-smoked through the conversation. He told her that in the spring of 1969, the same year the Wilsons fell ill, a containment alarm went off in Building 470, a structure later nicknamed the Anthrax Tower. According to Lytle, a technician had mishandled a ventilation valve during an aerosol test of Bacillus anthracis spores. The filters failed. Pressure built. And for several minutes, live spores were released into the exhaust system before being shut down. Lytle paused, staring into his coffee. They told us the filters caught most of it. But nobody ever checked where the rest went. Keene asked how far the wind could have carried the spores. Lytle answered quietly. Far enough to reach the houses on the hill. When she tried to verify the incident, she hit a wall of silence. The Army denied it. The CDC claimed no records existed. But she persisted, and soon, someone began watching her. She noticed a black sedan parked near her apartment more than once. Her phone line crackled with static during calls. A man claiming to be from the Department of Public Health visited her office, asking if she'd acquired any materials related to Fort Detrick. It was the early 80s, the Cold War's shadow years, when paranoia felt like air. But sometimes, paranoia is justified. Keene wrote her exposé, titling it, The Hill That Breathes. Her editor refused to run it. You're accusing the U.S. Army of poisoning civilians, he said. That's career suicide. 2 weeks later, her apartment was broken into. Her notes were gone. The typewriter ribbon had been pulled out and left coiled on the floor like a dead snake. She left Maryland soon after. Years later, in a private interview for a documentary that was never released, Keene said, "They didn't need to threaten me directly. The silence was enough. You can fight lies. But how do you fight nothing?" Fort Detrick, meanwhile, continued its transformation from offensive to defensive research. But defensive is a slippery word. It allows you to keep studying the same pathogens, just in the name of protection. The facility expanded its biosafety labs, housing agents from anthrax to Ebola. Locals noticed more security, more patrols, more air vents disguised as barns. But no one dared ask questions. The Wilson property was eventually sold to the government under the guise of ecological preservation. The house was boarded up, the land fenced off. Officially, it was part of a wildlife buffer zone. Unofficially, it was a tomb. And then, in the fall of 2001, something happened that dragged Fort Detrick back into the headlines: the anthrax letters. 5 people killed, 17 infected. Letters laced with finely milled anthrax spores sent to newsrooms and senators. The attacks terrified the nation, coming just weeks after September 11th. And when investigators traced the spores, all roads led to Fort Detrick. The FBI's Amerithrax investigation concluded that the strain used in the letters matched samples from the USAMRIID lab at Detrick. A senior scientist, Dr. Bruce Ivans, was accused. He died by suicide before trial. Case closed, or so the government said. But many researchers and even members of Congress questioned the findings. The timeline didn't fit. The motive was unclear. And crucial evidence had been destroyed. A 2009 National Academy of Sciences review quietly noted that scientific evidence alone does not conclusively support the identification of Ivans as the perpetrator. In other words, we still don't know who, or what really released those spores. And that's when old names began resurfacing. Journalists revisiting Fort Detrick's past stumbled upon records referencing MD-72 Alpha, the same file linked to the Wilsons. By then, most of the family was gone. John and Elaine had passed away. Rachel, the daughter, lived quietly in Pennsylvania under a different name. When a reporter tracked her down in 2010, she initially refused to speak. But a month later, she sent a handwritten letter. It read, "They always said it was coincidence." That's a word scientists use when they don't want to say cover up. I still dream about that humming sound. Sometimes I think it's still in me. Doctors who later examined her found residual scarring on her lungs consistent with exposure to aerosolized particulates. Not proof, but not nothing. Around that time, a batch of internal Army photos leaked online. One of them, labeled Field Survey 1969, Residential Perimeter, showed a white two-story house on a hill with a visible fenced compound behind it. The caption simply read, "Zone proximity, 0.18 miles." The internet did what it always does. Speculated, distorted, amplified.
Conspiracy forum exploded.
People claimed the house was haunted, that government trucks still visited at night, that glowing mist rose from the ground. Most of it nonsense. But a few details matched the historical record too well to dismiss. For instance, in the early 1970s, the U.S. Army ran Project 112, a series of secret tests involving biological and chemical agents, including one called Operation Whitecoat. Soldiers, often volunteers, were exposed to pathogens under controlled conditions at Fort Detrick to study immune response. Some of those soldiers later filed medical claims. Many developed chronic illnesses. And then there was Project MK Naomi, a joint CIA-Army bioweapons program housed partly within Fort Detrick. Declassified fragments suggested involved testing toxins like botulinum and ricin, exploring delivery mechanisms suitable for field use. Field use. The documents don't say where those fields were. But one internal memo from 1968 mentions controlled outdoor dispersion chambers. Another notes test housing within civilian distance tolerances.
Civilian distance tolérance.
3 words that shouldn't exist together. To this day, no one has officially explained what that means. Yet when satellite imagery of Fort Detrick's buffer zones became public in the early 2000s, analysts noted something eerie. Several areas previously marked as forest reserves matched exactly with neighborhoods built during the 1960s. One of them, the northern perimeter, lined up with the coordinates of the Wilson home. It's as if the facilities map expanded after people moved in, swallowing their lives into its boundaries without ever telling them. By the 2010s, a new generation of scientists began revisiting the history of biological research ethics. Some cited the Wilson case as an example of civilian collateral exposure. The government never acknowledged it. But internal correspondence obtained under the Freedom of Information Act referenced legacy liability concerns regarding pre-1970 testing. In plain English, they knew something happened. They just didn't want to pay for it. And maybe they couldn't. Because the truth, if ever confirmed, would unravel decades of denials. There's a quote often attributed to the philosopher Santayana: "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." But what happens when the past is classified? When forgetting isn't an accident, but policy? As I sifted through these accounts, reading fragments of redacted documents and fading witness notes, a pattern emerged, not just of negligence but of design. The sickness, the silence, the erasure, it all felt too deliberate. Too tidy. Almost like an experiment that never officially ended. If you visit Fort Detrick today, it looks unremarkable. Red brick buildings, clean sidewalks, flags fluttering in the breeze. But under the surface, literally, lies an intricate network of tunnels and storage vaults once used to contain pathogens and, according to some accounts, human test materials. In 2019, the CDC temporarily shut down portions of USAMRIID, citing failure to meet biosafety standards. Officials confirmed that there had been potential exposure events. No details were released. History, it seems, was repeating itself. That same year, residents near Frederick complained again about strange odors and fog after rain. One described it as chemical sweetness. Another said her garden wilted overnight. Coincidence? Or echo? Because sometimes echoes are louder than the original sound. There's something chilling about how easily we normalize secrecy, how quickly we learn to look away.
Maybe it's a survival instinct.
Or maybe deep down, we all understand what John Wilson must have felt in those nights of fever and hum, that the air itself can turn against you quietly without warning. The invisible has always frightened humanity more than the visible. A monster, you can see. But a microbe, an invisible engineered life form, can pass through your lungs, your blood, your lineage, without ever leaving a fingerprint. And if that life form was born not in nature, but in a laboratory hidden beneath the earth, who carries the sin of its creation? Is it the scientist who designed it? The soldier who ordered it? The politician who denied it? Or the ordinary family who inhaled it and never knew? The Wilsons were collateral in a war they never knew existed, a war fought not with bullets, but with spores and silence. And maybe that's the real horror of the story. That the most terrifying weapons don't explode.
They whisper.
There's an unsettling truth about places that have seen too much, they never stop remembering. Decades after the Wilsons left their home, the hill above Frederick still stands, quiet under the Maryland sky. The house remains, its paint dulled to gray, the front porch sagging like a tired mouth. The trees around it have grown thicker, swallowing the road that once led to the fence line. But something about it still feels awake. In 2016, a group of amateur historians from the University of Maryland began cataloging Cold War remnants across the state. They visited decommissioned missile silos, radar stations, and finally, the perimeter of Fort Detrick. One of them, a graduate student named Eli Turner, recorded a video as they approached the old Wilson property. It was late afternoon. The air was heavy, motionless. You can still find fragments of that footage online, a shaky handheld clip showing the group walking up a dirt path toward the hill. At first, everything seems ordinary. Birds, wind, the rustle of leaves. But then, about halfway up, the sound changes. There's a low vibration, almost below hearing, more felt than heard, a mechanical pulse that shouldn't be there. Eli's voice in the recording is calm at first, then uncertain. Do you hear that? It's like a motor underground. Moments later, the image flickers. The camera pans toward a section of ground where the grass looks darker, as if burned. A metal grate is half buried beneath the soil, circular, industrial, with faint lettering corroded by time. Zoom in, and you can just make out the words. U.S. Amriad Vent 3B. 3B. The same codename mentioned in Fort Detrick's old files, the test zone believed to have caused the Wilson contamination. The video ends abruptly. According to Eli's notes, their Geiger counter briefly spiked before malfunctioning. The team left soon after. None of them returned. That footage resurfaced 3 years later, when a researcher named Dr. Naomi Price, a microbiologist and whistleblower, began publishing a series of essays titled The Invisible Inheritance. In them, she argued that several regions around historic bioweapon sites still contain dormant genetic markers, not pathogens, but environmental DNA fragments capable of influencing microbial behavior. In plain terms, the land remembers what it was exposed to. Dr. Price referenced Fort Detrick specifically, suggesting that residual spores, even long dead, could leave molecular ghosts patterns detectable in soil microbes decades later. She wrote, "Every time the wind stirs the dust, those sequences rise again, not alive but not gone. They drift, settle, sleep. Memory disguised as dirt." When asked about the Wilson case in a radio interview, she hesitated, then said, "If they lived that close, it wasn't coincidence. It was geography meeting negligence. And sometimes, negligence is just another form of intent." She disappeared 6 months later. Her final blog post read only, "Some ghosts are airborne." Let's step back. Let's talk about the house itself. In 2020, a local real estate agency listed it for sale, the Chesterfield Road property, they called it. 3 bedrooms, 1 bath, large lot, unique historical interest. Price, $195,000. The listing lasted less than 2 weeks before being pulled. No official reason was given. But one potential buyer, a retired Navy engineer named Paul Reeves, posted online that during his walkthrough, he'd felt a low pressure in his chest, like standing near a running generator. The realtor told him it was probably tinnitus. Except the sound was caught faintly on his phone's audio recording, a steady rhythmic hum at 22 Hz. Humans can't consciously hear 22 Hz, but our bodies can feel it. It's called infrasound. It causes unease, nausea, even visions. Some believe it's one of the scientific explanations for haunted houses. So maybe the Wilson house isn't haunted by ghosts. Maybe it's haunted by vibration, by the endless subterranean breathing of machines that were never fully turned off. Or maybe it's haunted by what those machines once held. A few months later, the property quietly transferred ownership to a private company registered in Delaware, one that, according to corporate filings, shares a mailing address with a Fort Detrick contractor specializing in bioenvironmental remediation. The same company applied for a zoning variance to install a subsurface monitoring station. Whatever they're monitoring, it's not wildlife. There's a strange irony in how the story loops. The Wilsons were victims of something invisible, and now, 50 years later, the invisible has become our daily companion. Microbes, particles, radiation, data, things we breathe, ingest, and transmit without seeing. We think we've conquered nature, but the truth is, we've just learned to manipulate it in smaller and subtler ways. Fort Detrick isn't the only place like this. Across the United States, there are dozens of facilities: Plum Island off the coast of New York, Dugway Proving Ground in Utah, Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland, where biological and chemical experiments were conducted under the banner of national defense. Each of them has their own ghosts. In 1965, a mishap at Dugway killed 6,000 sheep after a nerve agent test went wrong. The government called it an accident. In 1979, in Sverdlovsk, then USSR, an anthrax leak killed at least 66 people. The Soviets denied it until decades later. Every nation has its Fort Detrick. Every empire buries its invisible wars beneath clean laboratories and patriotic language. But the earth keeps the receipts. The soil under the Wilson house, the air around the hill, they are like living archives. Every rainstorm, every gust of wind carries microscopic records of what once happened there.